All right, hello everybody. Welcome back. It's September the 2nd. It's Labor Day. Just the other day, Pluto retrograded into Capricorn. And I have to admit that Pluto has been retrograde since May, and I don't personally make that big of a deal out of doing videos or analysis for all the outer planet retrogrades, but there's something particularly significant to me about Pluto going back into Capricorn, and that's because after this retrograde, which will last just a few months, it will be the last time any of us will be experiencing Pluto in Capricorn, because the Pluto cycle is long. Like, Pluto is the farthest outer planet that we use in astrology, in modern astrology, and it takes approximately 248 years for Pluto to do a complete revolution of the whole zodiac. So nobody alive today is ever going to have Pluto activating Capricorn in their chart ever again. And so there's something, if you understand what Pluto represents, Pluto, the basic archetype of destruction, death and rebirth, being a kind of a breaking down process, a shedding of old skin, all those kinds of things, that there's a certain, if you look at your chart, if you look at what whole sign house Capricorn represents, Pluto has these 3 months to have, it's like last call for Pluto in Capricorn. Last call for Pluto to do whatever business it has to do, and then none of us who are alive today are ever going to experience transits like this again. So that is very significant. And also, I have to admit that there's this whole thing about Pluto in Aquarius, which has a lot of significance because, it could be because of the age of Aquarius. I did a video when Pluto ingressed into Aquarius, and for some reason, my video on Pluto Aquarius got way more reach, way more views than a lot of my other videos. So Pluto retrograding out of Aquarius back into Capricorn for a few months is significant with this whole story. Now, the thing is about Pluto is that it's probably closer to being a malefic planet than a benefic planet. And Pluto is also often associated with stuff like oppression and fascism and a lot of stuff that's pretty negative, because Pluto was discovered around the time that Adolf Hitler came to power, around the time that the fascists came to power in the 30s, preceding World War II. And, you also had a lot of economic depression at the time in the 30s preceding. And so you use these populist mass movements, and these kind of like the unconscious forces of the masses all having a lot to do with Pluto. So I'm just, as a heads up going into this one, this is not exactly the most happy-go-lucky or positive transit, and it is made more difficult because the aspects Pluto is going to be making, particularly to Mars, because Mars right now is in Gemini. Mars has just been involved in the conjunction with Jupiter in Gemini, with the square to Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, and we recently just had Venus and Virgo that was setting off this big T-square. So the intense T-square in the mutable signs that we've been experiencing over the past few weeks is now easing off, with Mars leaving Gemini and entering Cancer. And what's going to happen is that Mars is now moving in forward motion through Cancer, and Pluto is moving in retrograde motion, and eventually the two are going to meet at the very end of Capricorn and Cancer at 29 degrees, which, and this is it doesn't, like, I'm gonna just preface this that this is from a point of view of mundane astrology, this particular transit does not look very good. And I'll give you a number of reasons why. And I'm not doing this, I don't want to incite doom and gloom and all this kind of stuff, but I'm just giving my just honest read of this one. And, take it with a grain of salt. But the main stuff about this is that if you look, let's compare this to recent transits, right? Like before Mars was in Gemini, Mars was in Taurus, and around the time when Mars made its conjunction with Uranus, we saw the attempted assassination on Donald Trump, and similarly to, I think you can expect some kind of media event of similar magnitude when this Mars-Pluto opposition takes place. And although, because it is not Uranus that is involved, it's Pluto that is involved, I think that if you look at what happened with Mars-Uranus, you can see that there's some kind of a precedent for these transits between Mars and the outer planets to set off some kind of generally negative event, right? I will leave out the, whatever your thoughts on certain politicians and all this kind of stuff. I'm not going to get into that stuff right now. But the thing about it is that if you basically break down what's going to be different about a Mars opposition to Pluto versus the recent Mars conjunction to Uranus, is that Uranus, for one thing, a quality of rebellion, right? You've got a young, the shooter, some, disgruntled young person who is rebelling, an act of rebellion. You've also got something which is a surprise. It's something that it took everybody off guard. Nobody saw it coming. There's a sense of them not being prepared for it, of being kind of like blindsided, and it being a kind of shocking news event. And then if you understand what the Pluto archetype is in contrast to the Uranus archetype, you can expect things to do with, unfortunately, we're already seeing in the news a story about how in Gaza there is a report of polio in Gaza, and polio was something that I think goes very well with this idea of a Pluto retrograde into Capricorn, because oftentimes Pluto has some association with infectious diseases, because if you go back to when the COVID pandemic first started, there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction that on its own, it was kind of gnarly, but then when you had Mars get in on that, Mars, Saturn, and Pluto together, it was associated with the beginning of the pandemic, right? And also, if you look at when you had Pluto in Scorpio back in the 80s, this was around the time when I was born, there was the AIDS epidemic, right? So Pluto, while Uranus has more to do with maybe like the spirit of rebellious young people or like protests and stuff like that, Pluto has more to do with things like infectious disease, which is at a more microscopic level, which is like the idea of things which can be very small, like viruses, which can nonetheless have huge impacts on society. So there could be some sort of news around either COVID or, like I said, the polio in Gaza, things like that. Pluto is also often associated with things like espionage, spying, secrecy. It could be related to things like cyber crime, cyber attacks, or organized crime, things like blackmail, political scandals, things which have been kept. There's more to do with secrecy with Pluto, so it could be things which are kept hidden, certain things which are kept secret, which come out into the open and have a particularly kind of damaging effect, right? Or that the idea that blackmail, like the whole idea of like Epstein and that whole controversy of Epstein, is obvious that the whole game that Epstein and those people were playing was a game of entrapment. That if you could entrap people if you could get rich and powerful people, and you would have them under your thumb if you had a videotape or some evidence of them doing something they shouldn't with abused, sex trafficked children or something like this, right? All that kind of stuff goes with this Pluto retrograde. And the fact is, like, we are not going to have, like I said, Pluto is not going to be in Capricorn for any of our lifetimes. So if there's any sort of thing that's going to be triggered by this within the next few months is when it's going to happen, right? And so I'm approaching this from I'm starting this, I'm just giving you a basic mundane prediction of what to expect from this. And I mean, just to go over it, the opposition between Pluto and Mars is going to perfect on November the 3rd. And to make matters worse, unfortunately, is that this opposition is going to be happening on the 29th degree, and that the 29th degree is called the killing degree. There is, in traditional astrology, the last degree is a critical degree, and when you've got Mars and Pluto opposing on a critical degree, I'm predicting you're going to see something, and it's probably going not. So I don't want to create too much doom and gloom around this, but there's bound to be something happening around this. And I imagine it should be pretty dramatic. And although, of course, this is September, we've got a couple months until this aspect actually perfects, until it happens. But Mars is just ingressing into Cancer a few days from now, September 5th. What's also interesting is that at this moment, when Pluto and Mars make their opposition, by this time in November, Venus will have ingressed into Sagittarius, and Venus will also be perfecting an opposition to Jupiter at the same time. So you've got maybe a bit of a silver lining in the sense that there could be particularly gnarly stuff happening with Mars and Pluto, but at the same time you've got the two benefics making that opposition, and so that there may be some kind of, there's got to be some sort of good news to balance it out, right? So to balance out whatever the doom and gloom is, there has to be some kind of good news with Jupiter and Venus making opposition at the same time. But if you think about this too, that you've got an opposition in the cardinal signs, you've got an opposition in the mutable signs, and then you've got at the same time around then it would be Scorpio season, and you would have the Sun making an opposition to Uranus. Not perfecting around that time, but also like just in the same ballpark. That the next, as particularly the beginning of November, is going to be like lit astrologically. There's going to be lots of stuff happening, right? And then shortly after, in November 20th, Pluto is going to be back in Aquarius, and this whole period of time where we have our little window for the last call for Pluto and Capricorn will be over by November 20th. I guess Pluto stations direct October 11th. Maybe I'm a bit disorganized with how I'm taking my notes here, but that's basically the rundown of what I'm expecting for Pluto in Capricorn based on the opposition it's going to make to Mars. Now I have an idea for the next part of this video, which I have to admit I am a little bit hesitant about, or at least I've already expressed on this channel a certain kind of hesitancy about going into one of the things that I've been doing is that I have an interest in philosophy as well as an interest in astrology, and I have been avoiding associating myself as a follower or adherent of any particular philosopher. As the case, that's usually what happens. I'm just reading a bunch of stuff and going with what I'm interested in, right? And people, there's a certain dynamic where I have to admit, like I'm not really. I don't know. This is a sort of like, how do you categorize yourself? Do I categorize myself as a New Ager or not? Or how am I supposed to define myself here? The thing is, I have some sympathy towards, despite all despite the fact that the New Age or online spirituality specifically can often be very disappointing or problematic or whatever you want to say, that I have some sympathy for these like very basic ideas of like, to put your energy towards, positive things and to be optimistic and to, positive affirmations and all this kind of stuff, and not to dwell on negative stuff or, that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But at the same time, I have an interest in philosophy, and oftentimes the philosophy is not really, at that same. It can get into stuff which is much more. You're looking at things which are much more negative and all this kind of stuff. But I have at least, this is my reason why I have hesitated to get really into Friedrich Nietzsche. Although I have a follower who follows my videos who has been, in the comments, understand, like, one of the things too is like not wanting to like get lumped into some stereotype of what people who are really into Nietzsche are like and all this kind of stuff, or the bad vibes associated with Nietzsche. Or even another example is that I've mentioned before that I have a history of being involved with like anti-psychiatry or mental health advocacy or different kinds of alternative mental health. And I was there, on Facebook at one point in time, a person who I had as some Facebook friend was on a group asking about like which philosophers struggled with mental illness, which philosophers experienced madness, right? And so I just listed off a few that I knew of, just off the top of my head, and Nietzsche was an obvious one. And then as soon as I mentioned Nietzsche as an example, I had another person who I had as a online friend from that community of people involved in radical mental health and whatever it would be, like alternative mental health or mental health advocacy, saying that like I've maybe because I'm not as involved in the scene anymore, but there's a certain attitude of like we're all agreeing that we're not going to use Nietzsche for this stuff. It may be true that Nietzsche was mad or did have mental illness or was a kind of eccentric, brilliant lunatic of a philosopher, but we're not going to use Nietzsche in our project for whatever radical mental health is going to be. But it's like, well, the question wasn't like, which mad philosophers have ideas which are useful for this particular application in our project, which were, it was just what philosophers experience madness, right? And so you can't even just approaching this. You run into this kind of minefield of everybody telling you, oh, don't talk about Nietzsche, And so I have taken also philosophy classes, and it's like I'm getting into what's kind of funny is that like there's this idea. I'm gonna have to read this book that Deleuze did about Nietzsche, because I've been listening to kind of on listening to podcasts about Nietzsche binge. Well, I don't know about a binge, but I've been listening to a lot of stuff about Nietzsche recently, and there's this whole kind of idea about like active versus reactive forces, and that actually goes goes a lot with this whole idea of like you don't want to just be stuck resisting something, resenting something, being stuck ruminating on something you're struggling with. You want to be actively, positively pushing the building up some new thing that you feel optimistic towards, not just resisting stuff. And that actually kind of goes with Nietzsche, right? But I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is that there's something about like even just taking, like I took some philosophy classes, and even just approaching the problem of Nietzsche always seems to trigger some kind of reactive force, or there's inherently resistance in the material. I think it's just like, there's a show that I used to watch as a kid, Red Dwarf, and the character Cat had this line like, if you eat fish, expect bones, right? So if you're dealing with Nietzsche, there's going to be some inherent resistance. There's going to be some inherent controversy. It just goes with the territory, right? But why am I bringing Nietzsche up in this video? It's because if you look at Nietzsche's astrology, he doesn't have Mars opposite Pluto. He does have Sun at 22 Libra opposite Pluto at 22 Aries. So that is a perfect opposition between Sun and Pluto, right? And then if you look at his Mars aspects, he has Mars at 27 Virgo opposite Jupiter at 26 degrees Pisces. So he is so I think there's something about the particular astrological moment I'm making a video for, which is at the time of recording this video, Mars is still in Gemini, in this conjunction with Jupiter, and it's separating from it, moving towards Cancer. And then once it is in Cancer, it will make this slow approach towards Pluto, which will eventually peak at the beginning of November. November 3rd is when the opposition between Mars and Pluto peaks. But there is something about, if you think about Nietzsche, has this quality of kind of, there's a certain loud and bombastic quality about Nietzsche that I think very much goes with this Mars-Jupiter opposition, which could be maybe tonally similar to the Mars-Jupiter conjunction we've just been going through, and that the Pluto dynamic. There's also this thing that I've got attracted to reading Nietzsche, partly because in Richard Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, he talks about understanding the Pluto archetype, and Richard Tarnas has this way of like bringing in other mythic figures to try to understand what Pluto is, or what the outer planets are about. Because Richard Tarnas sort of makes this argument that we shouldn't get too hung up on the specific naming associations that were given to the outer planets, because to be honest, it's like if you're serious about using the outer planets and incorporating them into astrology and understanding how they actually work, that for example, like Uranus and Neptune, there's this whole like the actual Greek deity Neptune is like not really the best fit for what people usually talk about Neptune as this kind of like salvific, self-sacrificing kind of mother, like unconditional motherly love and whatever. And if you look at the god Neptune was a guy who got really pissed. Like the god Neptune was competing with Athena to name Athens, and the god Neptune lost, and he was all pissed off about it. And he's like, you've got a male god. It's like the actual deity Neptune maybe does not really go with Neptune so much. And when you've got Uranus, Richard Tarnas says that Prometheus is maybe a better myth to understand Uranus than the Uranus, the sky god that was castrated by Saturn, right? So they're in the same way that, Pluto being Hades, Zeus's brother, all this kind of stuff. That actually maybe works a little bit better. But what there's this the basic thing that Richard Tarnas was trying. What I'm getting at here is the Dionysian archetype for Pluto, right? And that the Dionysian, the whole idea of like the Apollo and Dionysus as a kind of binary was talked about by Nietzsche in this book, The Birth of Tragedy. And I just mentioned all this stuff. I'm mentioning all this stuff about, like the whole New Ager thing about how you, rather than be, you want to be, like The Secret, right? Like you want to just like have good vibes and focus on all the things you like and all the things, and it's sort of like, well, then I had sort of like that part of me is like, Dan, why are you buying The Birth of Tragedy? Also, the point is that this is the very first book that Nietzsche wrote, and that if you listen to people who are Nietzsche scholars, everybody says that this book isn't very good, right? Or that like and even there's an introduction of like Nietzsche doing like self-criticism of him being a bit older, and he's like kind of basically like, looking back on this one was kind of cringe, but I also, as a young man, I bought a copy of Zarathustra, and I never read it. And I was going to start reading it, and then I just got the sense that I needed to start somewhere else, so I asked some people online for recommendations, and they got me started. They suggested if you're going to start reading in Nietzsche, a good place to start is The Gay Science, right? So, and there's something about the Pluto, like the Gay Science is a good one to read in the sense that it is written in the form of aphorisms. And what's kind of funny is that like I have some Nietzschean kind of style philosopher, poet kind of intellectual people on Facebook, and I noticed a lot of people actually sort of start adapting the writing style of Nietzschean aphorisms to Facebook. A lot of the length of these ratings could easily just be like Facebook posts or something like that, right? Like they're not like that's like an aphorism. It's not like just like a one sentence thing. It's a little bit more than that, but they're not very long. So in the age where everybody doesn't have an attention span anymore, it's pretty easy just to pick up, just read one aphorism at a time, and you're not putting too much strain on yourself, right? So it's maybe Nietzsche is really the philosopher for our modern times, when people have just like blown their attention span to smithereens, and Nietzschean aphorisms are here for you, right? So, but to understand the basic dynamic of the Pluto archetype, I thought there were some aphorisms that might be worth reading. So I'm going to read aphorism number 342 from The Gay Science. And it starts, incipit tragedia, the tragedy begins. When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and Lake Ermi and went into the mountains. There he enjoyed his spirit and his solitude, and for 10 years did not tire of that. But at last his heart changed, and one morning he rose with the dawn, stepped before the sun, and spoke to it thus: "You great star, what would your happiness be if you did not have those for whom you shine? For 10 years you have climbed up to my cave. You would have become weary of your light and of the journey had it not been for me and my eagle and my serpent. But we waited for you every morning, took your overflow from you, and blessed you for it. Behold, I am sick of my wisdom, like a bee that has gathered too much honey. I need hands outstretched to receive it. I want to give away and distribute until the wise among men enjoy their folly once again, and the poor their riches. For that I must descend to the depths, as you do in the evening when you go behind the sea and still bring light to the underworld, you over-rich star. Like you, I must go under, as men put it to whom I wish to descend. Bless me then, you calm eye that can look without envy, even upon an all too great happiness. Bless the cup that wants to overflow, in order that the water may flow from it, golden, and carry the reflection of your rapture everywhere. Behold, this cup wants to become empty again, and Zarathustra wants to become man again. Thus Zarathustra began to go under. And so this is really, I think, a great poetic expression of what has come to define the Pluto archetype, right? And that the Pluto archetype, and he even just talks about the journey to the underworld, bringing the light to the underworld. The sun that is up in the heavens is a kind of a sun-setting evening thing, going down the journey to the underworld that is defined by Hades, that is defined by the death and rebirth and all that kind of stuff. Now the thing is that the problem is that there is this problem of the association of Pluto, as I said, with fascism, with oppression, all this kind of stuff. And I think the basic problem is that people think about I don't know. There's a lot of bad takes on Nietzsche on the internet that make the idea of becoming an overman all about self-mastery, or you're going to be the ultimate kind of Giga Chad and just dominate and all that. But the basic premise is that by trying to do the heroic thing, by trying to self-actualize and trying to live your highest potential, you are bound to some kind of failure, right? And there is I remember there's a DELTRON 3030 song when I was just a teenager, not even that, a pubescent boy in the Y2K era. I got really into the cyberpunk nerd rap supergroup called DELTRON 3030, and they had a particular song. I'm gonna have to I can't remember which song it is exact. Could be the one Madness where they sample the Penny Family, although it might be a different one. But they have the line, try to get over, you're gonna go under, right? And so the whole striving to become the overman, or the idea that you're gonna try to get one over, is doomed for folly. You're doomed to fail. And that's basically what happened with the Nazis, right? But the thing is, there's something about this with the Nazis. The problem with Nietzsche is that, there is something inherently kind of dodgy about Nietzsche, or in that a lot of if you read in this book, at the end of this book, it sounds a little bit anti-Semitic. It sounds a little bit you can see why he influenced the fascists to some degree. But Nietzsche himself wasn't a fascist. Nietzsche himself wasn't a Nazi. Nietzsche himself also didn't believe in German superiority. He didn't, Nietzsche probably would have laughed about the Germans thinking that they were some kind of had some sort of superiority. Or there's a lot of times, Nietzsche's kind of funny, because if you try to go in with a preconception of him and you have that idea of him, Nietzsche just flat out disses the German ethnicity. He does not think, he thinks the Germans are dumb because they drink too much beer, right? We just had, and there's this whole thing about like the Nazi beer hall push, where like Hitler's basically taking the dumbest, most, you know, the most dumb, brute force, violent people and trying to rile them up in a stupid way to get some sort of brute power. You know, it like you can get the sense that Nietzsche's probably smarter than that. I don't know. These are just some reactions that I have reading Nietzsche anyways, right? But the basic idea is that you've got a bunch of people who think that they are somehow superior, and they're going to try to like take that to some extreme, like taking over the world, imposing their own, you know, imperialistic, totalitarian conquest, and it's basically just, you know, they're a suicide, right? Like it's not just destructive of other people, it's self-destructive, and it forces some kind of transformation, right? And you know, I also think it's funny, like I haven't traveled all that much, and I've been, one of the things that I have a bit of money saved up. If I wanted to, I could go traveling. I've been thinking, you know, like to do the European trip, to go to like, I don't know, the typical, you know, go to Italy, go to France, go to Spain. I haven't been to those places. I have been, however, to Berlin, you know? And it's sort of thing, it's like there's something funny about Berlin, in that you had the place that was once associated with this, you know, the seat of power for the Nazis and all this kind of stuff, and the persecution of all the people who are different, for all the people who are judged to be inferior, like all the, you know, the gays, the Jews, the Roma people, like all these, but you know, and now like Berlin is like, it's where all the queer people, all the people with funny piercings, all the people who don't fit in congregate and party, right? Like there's some kind of like, if there's something about, and that feels like, I mean, it's maybe kind of obvious to comment on, but there's some kind of like, I mean, there's obviously still people who may be Nazis in Germany, who may be fascists in Germany, but there's something about like the culture of the German. I don't think the Germans are going to go back to that after going through it. Like you kind of get the sense that maybe they got that out of their system, and that's probably the last place you're going to expect that to crop up again, right? And that there's a certain sort of like, if you look at the obvious associations with people like Donald Trump and the accusations of fascism, you know, it's hard not to make those accusations, because if you look at a very basic level of like, you know, when people do those videos where they compare the facial expressions and mannerisms of Donald Trump to Mussolini, it's like he's not even trying it. He's just innately that way. He just innately has some quality that's similar to a fascist dictator. That's just kind of like who he is. Right? Or that's what it's like, a personality type or something, right? But there's this idea that it's like, it's kind of crazy, it's kind of dumb, it's kind of suicidal, it's kind of self-destructive, it's kind of like, you know, and this Mars-Pluto thing is like, it feels like you're headed into a head-on collision with some bad stuff, right? But the idea, like, this whole thing about the Nietzschean perspective is that, you know, if you try to get over, you're going to go under, right? If you try to make America great again, you're probably going to do the opposite. You're probably going to fuck America up and make America worse than it's ever been, right? By trying to do the good thing, you end up doing the bad thing, and you fuck up, and you're wiser for it, right? You go through this, and that's what the Pluto archetype is this trial of being all like, oh shit, I guess I'm not the heroic, you know, yeah, I guess I'm not the hero after all. I guess I'm actually the villain. Oh shit. You know, like you find out after you go through, oh shit, I guess we were the bad guys. Oh, what are we going to do? You know, like and that's the idea of shadow projection and shadow integration. Do you scapegoat all these other people for your problems? Do you identify, you know, everything's bad because of migrants and gay and trans people or lazy unemployed people or all the, and we're gonna have to blame all of them because we're the heroic people that are good, and then after you go through this process, oh shit, we're the villains. Oh, who would have thought, right? I don't know. That's kind of so there is I mean, I don't know. It's a good time, I guess, for shadow integration or not getting too caught up in your own self-righteousness or whatever. But then the whole problem is that for the position, if you're a left who's against Trump, it's too easy just to say like, oh no, these guys are fascists. They're the bad, but it's like the politics is just messed up. I don't think there's any. I don't expect that doing this video is going to help the political situation. I'm just, it is what it is, right? Now there's a couple other things I wanted to read, and I think I'm going to leave. I think that's going to be it for the gay science for right now. But I did pull this one off my shelf for a reason, because, as I said, in that last aphorism, he talked about the journey to the underworld, or you try to get over, you're gonna go under, and that whole thing was there from the beginning of his work in The Birth of Tragedy, or the going under is the tragic thing where you realize, by your vision of making the world a better place is actually you becoming a monster. And being a villain or something like that. They're the hero, I don't know. It's not just that. There's this idea that if you take it back to this whole thing about the Apollo and Dionysus, is that, to give a very brief summary of what he's doing in this book, that there's this idea that the Dionysian represents an immersion. Or you talk about this thing about like boundary dissolving experiences, right? That there's this idea of, or the idea on one hand of like a kind of, he turns this into, eventually this is the conversation about Apollo and Dionysus is very much in the Nietzsche's take on ancient myths, right? And Apollo was the god of light and darkness. And what's interesting about Apollo is that people often associate Apollo with the light more than the darkness. But Apollo actually stands for both of them. And there's a lot of really interesting myths around Apollo that apparently the crow is... because if you think about crows, what do you think about? You think about like Halloween, spooky stuff. You think, what god would be associated with the crow? Like, well, Saturn is associated with the color black, or is it Hades because it's all, like eating they're carrion birds that might eat dead things, or but the crow is actually associated with Apollo. And there's this idea that the mythic story goes that once upon a time the crows were actually white. And then, I can't remember the whole story. You'll have to look it up. But the crows were turned black, right? And so that the Apollo isn't just about the light. It's the light and the darkness. It's not just. It's about, and that light darkness metaphor being something about like knowledge and ignorance, right? And that there's some basic idea of being reserved. Right? Or being detached. Or we have this idea of like the Apollonic associated with science, right? That we can have a kind of understanding about the way things work that is detached from, that is maybe abstract in the sense that it's not knowledge from experience, but it's kind of like a hypothesis about how things are, or that in a scientific framework, it's like, or it could also be like your parents, when you're a kid, your parents tell you about the world and they give you a moral lesson, right? That, you're to do all these things. Don't lie, cheat, steal. Don't drink too much. Don't go and, or like these basic moral things. Like, don't go. It could be like promiscuity, I think goes very well with the Apollo Dionysus, right? Because you were supposed to have this sort of virginal purity, save yourself from marriage, don't be a slut, don't go around drinking and partying, don't go mix yourself up with the wrong crowd, stay on track, and we have, but the person is basically in that position, doesn't know why they should or shouldn't do this from experience. They have either a formula, a moral formula given to them by their family, given to them by society, or that is sort of like removed from the actual experience of, living your own life, making mistakes, finding out for yourself why you should or shouldn't do things, why you should avoid things or not, right? Dionysus was the god of wine and revelry, right? So there's this sort of quality that there's a certain sober clarity associated with Apollo of being detached and sober and knowing the right way and knowing to avoid certain things. But that avoidance is a kind of shadow in that it's not actually, you could get the sense of the Apollo being like the homeschool kid, right? A kid that's homeschooled or private schooled who has a certain virtuous attitude, but also has a sort of lack of worldliness, right? So they're kind of, and they might seem like a goody two-shoes that doesn't have the actual lived world experience of, and they're kind of like, they have a certain light of virtuosity, but that's contrasted by a kind of like something, maybe they're privileged. Maybe it's like the person who's lived in a privileged, the walled garden, the gated community, protected from the nasty stuff outside, whereas Dionysus is all about a mass of drunken revelry. Going out to party, getting mixed up in the crowd, losing yourself in the crowd, losing yourself in the and I don't know. I mean, this, in my own experience, I look at this archetypally as when I did my trip to Australia, because from the point of view of being a Canadian, and the language of calling Australia the down under, that by going to Australia for a whole year and also being a young person who was more inclined to party and and get intoxicated than do anything really productive while I was over there, it was kind of like a going under, right? And a literal going under, because I was going to, like the sun travels to the other side of the hemisphere and goes under, that I was the son of the family going away and going under and experiencing this kind of like Dionysian revelry, immersion in the masses, intoxication, and a kind of deterioration or coming apart and being, kind of and that perhaps leading to my own struggles with mental health, or at least when coming back to the family after all this, it was kind of a different situation after, having like going through all that and then trying to reconcile that with whatever was left of my old life where I lived with my family and whoever when my friends were around. It was kind of, that was part of the tension that led up to me having a psychosis and mental health crisis and stuff like that, and also why that led me to become interested in Nietzsche as a philosopher who dealt with madness and all this kind of stuff, right? So with that in mind, that explanation of Apollo and Dionysus, I would like to read a little bit here from I'm just going to read this paragraph and go in, well, you can see why, okay? The ecstasy of the Dionysian state, with its annihilation of the usual limits and borders of existence. The whole idea that people have associated with psychedelics being about boundary dissolving, that this is right here in Nietzsche, that Nietzsche is defining the Dionysian as the boundary dissolving experience. With its annihilation of the usual limits and borders of existence, contains for its duration a lethargic element in which all past personal experience is submerged. And so this chasm of oblivion separates the world of everyday reality from that of Dionysian reality. However, as soon as that everyday reality returns to consciousness, it is experienced for what it is with disgust. An ascetic mood which negates the will is the fruit of those conditions. In this sense, that the Dionysian man is similar to Hamlet. Both have at one time cast a true glance into the essence of things. They have acquired knowledge, and action is repugnant to them, for their action can change nothing in the eternal essence of things. They feel that it is laughable or shameful that they are expected to repair a world which is out of joint. Knowledge kills action, and to action belongs the veil of illusion. That is the lesson of Hamlet, not that cheap wisdom of Hans the Dreamer, who fails to act because he reflects too much as a result, as it were, of an excess of possibilities. No, not reflection, no, but true knowledge, insight into the horrific truth, outweighs any motive leading to action. In Hamlet as well as in the Dionysian man, now no consolation is accepted. The longing goes beyond the world after death, goes beyond even the gods, even existence, together with its glittering reflection in the gods or in an immortal other world, is negated. Conscious of the truth once glimpsed, man now sees all around him only the horrific or the absurd aspects of existence. Now he understands the symbolic aspect of Ophelia's fate. Now he recognizes the wisdom of the forest god Silenus. It disgusts him. And that is also archetypally one of the things to watch out for with Pluto and Mars in opposition in these signs, is there's a problem with psychologically, first of all, Pluto having to do with hatred and disgust, and the way the Nazis used the inherent hatred and disgust of the German people to mobilize their war machine and do all the terrible things they did, and the way that Nietzsche has been used by the Nazis, right? It is a problem, and but it's archetypally there with, what's interesting is that Pluto as a planet was not discovered at the time that Nietzsche was writing this. Pluto was only discovered when the Nazis were coming to power. And so that whole association of Pluto and what it meant was drawing on the genealogy of what the Nazis were getting their ideas from, and this obviously was an influence. But what's funny though is that the influence was explicitly stated to be a tragedy. If you're saying, this is the whole point, is that like the people, the people are kind of dumb and ignorant. And if they really think they're going to have some conquest where they become the masters of the world in some sort of conquest, they're only going to lose and enact a tragedy not only for their enemies but for themselves as well, right? And Nietzsche knew that this was a problem from the beginning. Nietzsche was probably smarter than that. Nietzsche probably would have thought the Nazis were idiots, right? But I mean, there's this other thing about like the problem of and why this is, there's something about this which is resonant or relevant to me, in that, as there's this whole thing about like people being, there's always, I find there's, maybe a lot of the time this pressure is just something I've internalized, because it's not like I get people in my outer life always trying to urge me to do things, right? But I had this, after I got back from Australia, after I had mental health challenges, I had a particular friend I met in the psych ward who I eventually stopped hanging out with because I had to admit he got on my nerves a little bit, and I don't even, sometimes I don't have any control over whether or not this guy watches my videos. I don't know if he still watches my videos or not. But that was one of the problems I was dealing with when recording videos for this channel, is that I have certain people that I don't hang out with anymore, and that I'm not as friendly with anymore. And if I put something out for public on the internet, I can't control who watches it. It's not up to, I don't have any, I mean, I could block specific accounts or something, but I'm not, somebody could just be logged out or logged into a different account, and I can't control who watches my stuff, right? But one of the things one of the things about this guy, because as somebody who had just spent a whole year overseas in a kind of this Dionysian thing about, partying, doing too many drugs, kind of getting lost in the masses of, getting immersed, boundary dissolving experiences, and going through the stupid psych word, that I don't like psychiatry, don't have anything good to say about psychiatry. I'm sorry, but there's something about, in the aftermath of all this, there's some pattern with this particular friend of mine. Then this guy would always be like, well, don't you want to go traveling? Don't you want to go back to Australia? Don't you want to go party? Don't you want to go to music festivals? Don't you want to do this? Don't you want to play in a band? And it's sort of like, that annoyed the fuck out of me, because it doesn't, there's certain, like, not really understanding that it's not like, I'm not some guy who's just like a young guy who never left my mom's house, who never went out and did anything in the world, who's lost, there's this archetype of the puer who is a dreamer, right? And this is where Nietzsche's talking about Hans the dreamer, who is like some person who's lost in their dreams and fantasies of all these things that they could do, but they're too scared to, or they're just a little infant child that doesn't want to go out and experience the world, all this kind of stuff. And that, because I don't know, I look young, right? I look young for my age. Maybe I do have a bit of the puer archetype, right? But the Dionysian archetype is the person who actually goes out, tries to, or even if you're just like, rather than having some heroic ideal, if you just want to be like, well, I just want to have fun, I just want to party, I just want to try to do my best to, life is short. It's like the millennial YOLO thing. YOLO, you only live once. You go out, have a fun time, get in trouble, but then there's something about that which is like, it ends up, what I noticed, especially about like, part of this was like going to like music festivals or like rave, psytrance, doof parties or whatever, right? But I noticed that if people who stick with this, it's like there's a certain naivety of like young people, and then there's the people that are obviously kind of like veterans of the scene who are maybe a little bit more jaded or have seen it all, and they're not like, they still do it, but they have a, you can sense that they by even just doing the thing that you supposedly love, that you're passionate about, that you're constantly kind of being worn down by this, or that bad, or also in worst case scenarios, bad shit happens, right? Like in the context of like partying, like people could be like driving home and be a bit too hungover and get into car accidents. And this is stuff that happens, right? Or people could overdose, or people could get a bad batch of something, or people could, or like, fight. There could be a fight, or I went to a party once and it got shut down because some guy was murdered at a party that was supposed to be a bunch of hippies who are all into love and light, all this kind of like, we're just going to like set our intentions and be all about peace and love, and oh shit, somebody just got killed, right? Like, this is the whole thing, that if you and there's this basic idea of like, fuck around and find out, right? If you're coming from this naive place, and you gain experience through trial and error, your naivety, that there's the archetype of the fool, the idea of like the fool card in tarot is like the fool who is ready to just jump off the cliff because he's just up for it, right? And like, this friend of mine was like, I kind of, in some way I admired him because he was very active. He'd be really up to just like try things out, to like go do different, and I was very contrasting him because there's some part of me that was a motivation to do things that got kind of burnt out, that kind of got extinguished maybe by going out and trying to have fun and trying to do all this thing and in being, it's not really that anything necessarily tragic happen, but there's something about that I just became disillusioned with that, or that the naivety that kind of lifestyle was going to be the answer to my problems kind of got burnt out, right? Or there's something about that I still, I'm not ruling it out that I'll never go to a party, or I'll never go to a rock concert, or I'll never try to have fun again, but there's some kind of, like what Nietzsche calls the lethargy, that there's something about, or there's this thing of the renewal, right? That something breaks down, something gets destroyed, but there's a death and there's a rebirth. But in the process of your life, you're not just getting a reset back to being the puer, the child, the innocent child who hasn't, because you have your life experience, right? You have been through this stuff. You have experience of the world. You are not a child anymore, and you're not the little kid who is lost in fantasies of all the things he could do or his ideas, and he's just not. The point is that you did some shit and you saw how it went, and you know that you're probably not going to do it that way again because you know what to expect from that. And in this sense, for me, it like translates into I'm really just not interested in psychedelics, right? I'm not interested. Before, I had this kind of naive idea that I could I could like model my personality of being a trippy guy who's into psychedelics and, exploring consciousness. And then, you end up your own, if you do that until you go have a psychosis and you're like, I think I could live the rest of my life and never take any of these substances again, and I'd be cool with it, man. It doesn't really matter to me at this point, or like all these, trying, like having a naive idea that you're gonna go to, like, here where I live in BC, the big festivals like Shambhala. I never went to Shambhala because my version of Shambhala was like going to like Rainbow Serpent in Australia, and there's something about it which was like, there's some experience that I had in Australia at Rainbow Serpent of just really being kind of disappointed by it, right? Or really just feeling kind of like disillusioned that, this isn't really my thing, right? And it's being kind of like, but I still have there is this part of me that just likes music, that likes having fun, that likes dancing, but there's something about like actually like to go, there's these things that are like presented to you as like carrots at the end of the stick that you have to like, you're going to like try to get this carrot, and that's going to be the thing that's going to like satisfy your desire, but then you get the carrot and it's not what you expected it to be, and then you see everything from a totally different point of view, and then you are transformed in that you're like, I don't think I would do that again. Or like if I was gonna do, if I'm gonna set out and approach this again, I maybe would do something different. But then each time you set out to do something different, to do something new, like you have some heroic idea of you want to actualize yourself, or you want to realize some sort of desire, you're going to hit some sort of problem, and you're going to become perhaps jaded or disillusioned, or that part of you is not going to stay the same. It's going to be, this is where they talk about Pluto as the archetype of transformation, right? And it's just like, though, ever since I got back from Australia, or ever since I went through this experience of, I relate to it as like, I ended up getting more involved in the spiritual emergency community, who saw it as the, like, breaking down is waking up. Like there's something, the personality structure before hit some sort of impassable obstacle and then was breaking down, but there's something that emerges out of that, which is an appreciation for spirituality, an appreciation for there's something in this about how, like, personally I relate to it. I still am a little bit interested in, like, I'm not completely disinterested in, like, the rave scene, the party scene, but there's something about, like, like, too much lasers, too much light show, too much, like, even, there's something about it which is just, like, I know it's not what I'm looking for. And I know that there's a certain naivety where of people who act like, because there's some kind of there's this awkwardness of like getting back from Australia and having gone through that experience of going under, or then leading into the real going under of going the psychosis as the journey to the underworld, and it precipitated by things of like trying to make friends in the music scene here in Canada. And I had one friend that I went to a few parties with, and she introduced me to a friend of hers, and the guy was like a laser technician, and being like, there's some sort of thing of just not gelling, right? Of like this guy like, yeah, man, we're gonna get all the lasers, we're gonna get the sound system that is like 100,000 watt sound system and all the big booming lasers, and we're gonna be all high on drugs and all that, and just kind of just like, there's something about whatever it is that what drew me to like a psychedelic experience is like, I do like music, but there's something about just this like cheap EDM, lasers blasting in your face and loud music and like girls in bikinis and stuff. It's sort of like there's that part, whatever that was there, that whatever thought, like it just was getting burnt the fuck out and being like, I'm really not interested. You know what I mean? And like this conflict of being like, I think I want to make, I think I like this and I want to make friends, but then it's sort of like all the people you meet are like mirroring to you something about it that you don't like, right? And there's a sort of, but you don't want, I mean, I don't know, I don't relate to this as like, you know, you don't want to like falling into the risk or the danger of like hatred and disgust or like an attitude of superiority or all, but like, using Shambhala as an example, even in those that leading up to that final just breaking down, which was really a breaking down of like my going to parties really at all, right? There was whatever there was that had an interest in doing that was just getting broken the fuck down. And having this friend being like, don't you want to go party with me, man? Don't you want to go travel and do all this fun shit? And it's like, no. And actually, the more you do that, the more it makes me really fucking irritated, right? Because you don't understand that I just did this and went through this process of just being like, maybe not, right? And then, but the more, then there's this friend being there as like a kind of irritant to be like, the more I think I want to do this, the more there's this guy irritating me, making me not want to do it, and that being this kind of like breaking down and transforming and developing a different. And I'm at the point now where like, I mean, it's kind of weird being in the COVID situation, because that's also been like a big breaking down, transforming, and it's sad to see, because I still am a bit conflicted, because music and creativity and art and even just having a good time. I'm not against having a good time, but there's something about it that like the more you do it, the more. I mean, they called them transformational festivals, right? But I don't really know if they like. If transformation meant you'd go there naive, being all like, I'm gonna hang out with all the kids with dreadlocks and crystals and have a good time, and then afterwards you're just like, ugh, like you're like, no thank, but you don't want to. You want to like have. There's some part of you that wants to like. There must be something good about it still, right? You don't want the transformation just to be turned off, being like, I'm not gonna do that again. I think I'm pretty before I had an idea that this was cool, and now I think it sucks. That's the transformation, right? But it is, I have to admit, there's something as time goes on, I could be growing up to, I don't know, but there's also this kind of like, this sense of like friends trying to like get you, or the feeling of being misunderstood, right? Being interpreted as being like a puer youngster who just hasn't left home, who just hasn't gone off to like be immersed in the world. But it's like, the point is that like, that's not, or just being misunderstood, right? Because the point is that I did do all that stuff, and it's by running up against what the problem was that drive started to kind of decompose, right? And like, I'm not saying that all my desires or my will or my has completely broken, but there's like, it's just been this process of all this stuff kind of like decomposing, deteriorating, and I have to admit, I have a tendency towards being kind of lethargic or inactive, and it goes with what Nietzsche's describing, right? That you go through all this stuff, you as an innocent, naive person, you fuck around, you find out, you gain knowledge, and then once you have knowledge, that kills the action. That kills the will to do the things that you were doing before. And that could be the more you resist that, the more you struggle with it, the more painful and conflicted you feel. But it's inevitable. You have to just kind of like accept that is part of the process, right? And that, and that maybe by letting these things decompose and break down, that something new can be born out of them, right? So man, I can't believe it. This is probably one of the longer videos I've done. It's an hour and 10 minutes already. Where has time gone? I will end it here because this is basically the gist of what I had to express. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like and subscribe. Tell all your friends. I'll be back with more because we're going to be having some pretty intense astrology over the next few months. There's definitely going to be something to talk about. Thanks for watching.